So the U.S. Constitution has been in effect since 1789. It is the oldest written national constitution in the world. A basic definition of constitution: what is a constitution? A constitution refers to the fundamental principles of a government and the basic structures and procedures by which the government operates to fulfill those principles. It may be written or unwritten. The most famous example of an unwritten constitution is Great Britain. They don't have a written constitution like ours. They have a collection of written laws and unwritten common laws. And the common laws are based on custom, culture, habit, judicial decisions, etc. We have a written constitution. Like I said, it's the oldest one still in effect. This is one specific document ratified at one point in time, formally amended through a deliberate process to change the written document, and that's the U.S. Constitution. Now, I want to talk about kind of the historic path to the U.S. Constitution and why each step here is important, what the lessons are from it. So start with 1776 and the Declaration of Independence. And this is the kind of philosophical core of the Declaration of Independence. It says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes distinctive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness." I think there are about 5 ideas here that I want to point out to you. 5 points that are kind of central to understanding our form of government, our theory of government. So the first is the idea that all men are created equal. Self-explanatory. And in some ways, you could say the history of the United States, the political history, is the attempt to put that ideal into effect, to make it real, to make it not just an ideal. The second idea to point out is that according to the Declaration, we are endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights. What that means is that our rights, according to this document, come from God, not from government. We are born with them. Or if you don't believe in God, they come from our very nature. He was kind of a deist, Jefferson was. It was a popular belief system at the time. But he believed that these rights are ours by our very nature, right? And a government can take them away, can violate them, but it has no ethical right to do so, no authority to do so. Right? I heard once a reporter ask, don't our rights come from the Constitution? If you think our rights come from the Constitution, you don't understand the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson would have said, no way. The Constitution doesn't give us our rights, it just acknowledges rights that we already have, right, that we were born with. Number 3, governments are created to protect or secure these rights. In 1776, this kind of turned upside down a conception of government that was popular. The government was created to rule over you, to make you obey, right? Because you needed it. Here, government is created to protect the rights that are yours by nature. Number 4, government's authority to rule over us comes from our consent. So if you ask yourself, how does the government have the authority, moral authority, to make me obey laws, to punish me if I don't obey those laws, right? To make laws and rules in my name? And the answer is because I consent to be governed. And why do I consent to be governed? Because I want the government to protect my rights. What if the government no longer protects my rights? What if it actually becomes abusive? And then I withdraw my consent, right? I don't consent to be ruled by a government that abuses me rather than protects me. Well, then we get the 5th point. People have the right to alter or abolish a government that fails to protect their rights. So it's a bargain. It's like a contract between me and the government. I consent to be ruled by it as long as it protects my fundamental human rights. If it stops doing that, I withdraw my consent, and now I have the authority to create a new government, right? To do what this government has failed to do. This was the philosophy that justified the American Revolution and independence. So they've declared independence, and there are 13 states that have done so. And the question arises, how will they be related to one another? Virginia and North Carolina and Massachusetts, they've all been independent colonies up until now. The answer for a while was in the Articles of Confederation. So this was written in November of 1777. There's a war underway, right? A revolution against England underway. And these articles will remain in effect, will go into effect in 1781 when the last state ratifies them, and they will remain in effect until 1789 when the Constitution is ratified and takes effect. So this was the first national government over the American states. It created a confederation or a league of friendship among the states. In some ways, it might be more helpful to think of it as like an alliance rather than a true national government. So Virginia and Massachusetts and New York essentially kept most of their sovereignty to themselves and agreed to ally with the other states in this confederation. So it created a weak national government with a unicameral legislature. By unicameral, I mean one body, right? Not divided into House and Senate, but just one congressional body. It created a government with very limited powers. Some of the powers were the power to borrow money, create a national army and navy, declare war, create post offices, sign treaties with foreign governments. Here are some powers that were not given, important powers. The power to tax, the power to draft soldiers, and to regulate commerce between the states and foreign nations. So think about how important those were. They're at war, right, with Great Britain, maybe the biggest power in the world at the time. And the Articles doesn't give the national government the power to tax. So how are they going to raise money to support the army? Well, they print money, or they borrow it. They go into debt. And printing money, they printed money called continentals, continental dollars. And they printed so much of it that it became essentially worthless. And the phrase "not worth a continental" became common. Or they borrowed money, or they requested money, requested contributions from the states, and those requests were often ignored. Now, the Articles did not create a national executive branch, so there was no president. They did not create a national judicial branch, so there was no Supreme Court. Each state was equal in power in the Congress with one vote, regardless of its size or its population. It was difficult to pass legislation because 9 out of the 13 states were required to agree to pass legislation. And it was virtually impossible to amend the articles. You had to have unanimous consent. Right? Unanimous agreement, all 13 states had to agree. So under this government, the states could tax each other. They could print their own money. They could make their own treaties with foreign governments. And many of them simply refused to uphold laws of the Confederation that they didn't like or didn't agree with. They just did their own thing. During this time period, 1770s, 1780s, while the War for Independence is going on and the Articles of Confederation are the framework for the national government, many of these states wrote their own constitutions. In fact, all of the colonies, except Connecticut and Rhode Island, wrote their own constitutions. These are some of the first written constitutions in the world, and they were revolutionary for their time for these reasons. One, each was a single written document that specified the principles, structures, and operating procedures of the government established by the consent of the people. They didn't like the fact that the English Constitution was unwritten. They wanted to get it down on words, in words on paper, so that everyone would know what powers the government had and what powers it didn't. They were all adopted at a specific moment in time. They transformed the legal status of people from that of subjects under the rule of a king who was sovereign into citizens sharing in popular sovereignty. So in the old way of thinking, the land and the people sort of belonged to the king. The king was the sovereign, and you were his subject. You belonged to him in a sense, or the queen. This flipped it upside down, right? The land and the country belong to the people, and the government merely represents them, is this new conception. This is a picture of John Adams, who was one of the principal writers of the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 and the Bill of Rights that were included, or the Declaration of Rights, in that Constitution. Notice the very first line. All men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights. In 1780, when he wrote that, there were still some slaves, there was still some slavery in Massachusetts. But within a year or two, some slaves went to court and they said, hey, what about this Massachusetts Constitution? The Declaration of Rights says all men are born free and equal. Not just all men are equal, but all men are born free and equal. And so the slaves said, doesn't that mean we're free? Hasn't the Constitution of 1780 declared us free? What do you think the court said? The court said no. The court said, you're right. You are free. That's what it says. And slavery ended in Massachusetts in accordance with that. So, some of the features of these constitutions: each of the state constitutions established a republic or representative democracy. They asserted explicitly that the people held the power, that government was instituted by the consent of the people and was to serve the people. Each of them included 3 governing bodies: a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. Most of the legislatures were bicameral, meaning 2 houses, right? House and the Senate, or an upper and a lower house. And bills of rights were included to ensure the protection of natural rights, such as freedom of speech, freedom of the press, trial by jury, freedom of religion, protection from excessive fines and bail, and protection from unreasonable searches and seizures. All of these would reappear in the United States Bill of Rights, but they were ideas that had actually been around for 100 years or more, hundreds of years in some cases. The only one that was truly new to the United States was the idea of freedom of religion. But you see them first in these state constitutions. Some problems with the state governments. So these are problems actually that reflected on the Articles of Confederation and the state governments. So Madison, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, and others thought that these state governments were out of control. They trampled on the rights of citizens. One thing they did, they printed so much paper money that creditors were cheated. So you might loan somebody $100, and then the state would just print tons and tons of dollar bills until the $100 that you loaned somebody was worthless. They would pay you back easily, and it was like you got cheated out of your money. These state governments sometimes confiscated the property of loyalists and denied them due process. A loyalist was someone who was loyal to the King of England. So there was a war going on, and some of these governments just confiscated those loyalist property and took it and said, you're on the wrong side, you're loyal to the king, we're going to seize your house, we're going to seize your land. Now, Madison and Hamilton, they were worried about that. They thought, well, wait a second, they still have rights to their property, right? They still have legal rights. You can't just take what's theirs without a trial, without accusing them of wrongdoing. If you can do that to them, you can do it to anybody. And so they were worried about this. And then an event happened in 1786 called Shays' Rebellion. This was in Massachusetts. It was led by a Bunker Hill veteran named Daniel Shays. Bunker Hill was one of the first battles in the American Revolution. And the source of the fighting, the cause of the rebellion, was high taxes and high interest rates that were causing a lot of farmers in western Massachusetts to lose their land in foreclosure hearings. So they rebelled. They closed courts that were foreclosing on farms. They demanded a moratorium, meaning a halt on debt collection. They demanded the printing of paper money. They wanted money to be printed so they could pay off their debts and not lose their farms. They threatened to seize a federal arsenal in Springfield, Massachusetts. And this was the important thing from the point of view of Washington and Hamilton and Madison. The National Congress did nothing to put down the rebellion. They just sat and watched. The rebellion was put down entirely by the people of Massachusetts on their own. And so Madison and Hamilton thought, if our central government, our national government located in Philadelphia at the time, is so weak, so inept, that there can be a rebellion going on in one of the states and they won't do anything to stop it, then we need a new national government. We need one with a little bit more force than that. They convinced enough people that they were right, that alterations needed to be made to the Articles of Confederation to meet in the 1787 Constitutional Convention. The original purpose of this convention was not to write a new constitution, but to revise the Articles of Confederation. Some of them thought all we need to do is tinker with it, add a power to tax, add a power to regulate commerce, and just leave it otherwise basically as it is. But the 55 delegates fairly quickly agreed, no, we need to scrap the Articles and just write a totally new constitution. George Washington was the chair of the convention. His presence was essential. He was the most popular, the most respected, the most trusted person in the entire country. They all pretty much agreed that the national government needed the power to tax, but after that there were fierce disagreements and controversies. A lot of them feared concentrated government power. They wanted the government to be just powerful enough to protect America from foreign enemies, to collect taxes, to maintain an army and navy, but not so powerful that it displaced the state governments completely or tyrannize them. Of the 55 delegates there, over half of them had legal training and a quarter of them had practiced law. But other than that, there was quite a variety. There were businessmen, physicians, farmers, one was a minister. 29 had served in the Continental Army during the Revolution. Most were wealthy, but not all. All but 2 or 3 of them had experience in government, either in the Confederate Congress, the Continental Congress, that was before the Revolution, or in state governments. And eventually 39 of them signed the Constitution on September the 17th, 1787. This is an overview of some of the differences between the Constitution they signed and the old Articles that they were replacing. So the Articles created a league of friendship, like an alliance between the states. We had a federal system of government with a true national government, but also state governments. In the old system, Congress could not tax, only request money. They gave Congress the power to tax. In the old Articles, Congress could not regulate interstate commerce. Here, Congress was given the power to regulate commerce between the states and with foreign nations. That's what interstate means. In the old system, there was no separate executive branch. The Constitution created a separate executive branch. It also created a national judiciary, the federal courts. There were no federal courts in the old system, no national courts. In the Articles, both the states and the national government had authority to coin money. The Constitution took that power away from the states, so they can't coin their own money anymore. They can't print their own dollars. Only the national government can. One of the biggest changes, in the Articles, each state had one vote, but now you have 2 houses. In the House of Representatives, the state representation is based on population. So big states like California and Texas have lots of representatives in the House. But in the Senate, the voting is equal. Each state has 2 seats, regardless of how big or small they are. Another very big change, you had to have a supermajority, 9 out of 13 states, to pass legislation in the Articles. Now you only need a simple majority, right? Just 50.1% in both houses of Congress. You had to have unanimous consent to amend the Articles of Confederation, but amending the Constitution is a little bit easier. You have to have 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states. Still very difficult, but not as nearly impossible as under the Articles of Confederation. So those are the major changes to the national government. Now I want to discuss some features or principles of the new government. Yes, ma'am? It'll be on Canvas, and you can find it there. So, one feature is that the framers wanted a limited government. Right? So this is the concept that everyone, whether citizens, whether you're in government or not, must obey the law. The president must obey the law. The Speaker of the House must obey the law. They can only do the things that the Constitution authorizes them to do. And there are some things that the Constitution specifically says they cannot do. Right? So their powers are limited by the Constitution. I'll give you some examples. Article 1, Section 9 lists powers denied to Congress. It says, the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it. The writ of habeas corpus was an ancient English doctrine which said that you cannot hold someone in jail, incarcerate them, detain them indefinitely, arbitrarily. In other words, without accusing them of a crime. So if someone was and this had happened in Great Britain. way back centuries ago, it was not uncommon for the king to get angry at someone, put them in the dungeon, and they would just sit there for years, never accused of a crime, never a chance to defend themselves in court, and they would be let out someday when the king stopped being angry, or they would be beheaded or whatever, worse. This is saying you can't do that. If the government arrests somebody and puts him in jail, they have to give him a chance to defend himself, to know what crime he's being accused of, and to defend himself against that accusation. Another part, Article 1, Section 9, no bill of attainder or ex post facto law shall be passed. A bill of attainder was when Congress, or in the old days Parliament in England, would pass a law, and the law would say, John Smith is guilty of treason and shall be hanged. Now, that's not a trial, right? He never has a chance to prove himself innocent. The law just decrees so-and-so is guilty and is going to be hanged. And that can't happen. Congress is denied the authority to do that. It would be immediately unconstitutional, null and void. Congress cannot pass ex post facto laws. An ex post facto law is a law that punishes someone retroactively for something that was not illegal when they first did it. So if we pass a law that says, what should it be? Well, I'll give you a very controversial example. Not that I want to take sides one way or the other, but Texas recently passed a law, the so-called heartbeat bill, outlawing abortions after, 6 weeks, 8 weeks of fetal development, right? And that is not an ex post facto law because it declares something illegal from this point in time going forward. What if that law had said, and anyone who has done such a procedure in the past is also guilty and shall be punished accordingly? That would be an ex post facto law. That would be punishing somebody for something that wasn't illegal at the time they did it, right? And that's clearly unconstitutional. Another one in Article 1, Section 9 says, no money shall be drawn from the treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law. This one seems very simple, but I think it's very important. In order for money to be spent out of the federal treasury, there has to be a law appropriating that money, right? It has to be in accordance with a law. It can't just be spent at the whim of an executive official, according to this. I think the idea of limited government is also in our 9th Amendment, which I'll talk about later, and our 10th Amendment, which I'll talk about later. But briefly, the 9th Amendment says, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. The 10th Amendment says the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. Just a little bit more about this idea of limited government. James Madison has been called the father of the Constitution. He was one of the main pushers for a new Constitution. He showed up 11 days early before anybody else got there in Philadelphia. He had spent months studying for the Constitutional Convention. He was studying the history of republics and confederacies. He published writings calling for a new constitution. So he wanted a stronger central government with the power to tax, to regulate commerce, and so forth. But he said this, he didn't want a new national government with unlimited power. He says, the general government is not to be charged with the whole power of making and administering laws. Its jurisdiction is limited to certain enumerated objects which concern all the members of the republic, but which are not to be attained by the separate provisions of any. The subordinate governments, which can extend their care to all these other subjects, which can be separately provided for, will retain their due authority and activity. So he's saying the general government, meaning the national government or the federal government, has limited powers. It cannot pass any kind of law that it wants. Only what it has been authorized to do, the enumerated objects. Another feature of the U.S. Constitution is federalism, or a system of dual sovereignty. So this is a system of government in which ultimate authority is divided between two levels of government, a central government and regional governments, with each level having ultimate authority over different policy matters and or geographic areas. So we're in Texas. Authority over us is divided between the national government and the Texas government. Both of them are sovereign. Both of them pass laws we're obligated to obey. And we're citizens of both, the United States and Texas. Another feature of the U.S. Constitution is separation of powers. So each branch of government has specific powers and responsibilities that allow it to operate independently of the other branches, so that no one group of government officials controls all the governing functions. Another feature is the system of checks and balances. So the idea is each of the branches has some way to restrain the power of the other branches to keep them from becoming too powerful, tyrannical. So the executive branch can veto legislation, and it can nominate judges to keep the other two branches under control. Congress has the power, obviously, to pass laws, but it can impeach a president and remove him or her from office if the president becomes abusive or tyrannical or unlawful. Congress, the courts have the power to declare laws unconstitutional. If Congress exceeds its constitutional authority, or the president does, the judicial branch is supposed to keep them in check. Another feature that's interesting and somewhat unique, I think, perhaps to our Constitution, is the Electoral College. And this system, a body of representatives, electors, elected by voters in each state, actually elects the president and the vice president every 4 years. So maybe some of you have voted in presidential elections, maybe not. If you vote in a presidential election, you are not technically directly voting for the person you've chosen. It might look like that because it has their name and picture and that sort of thing. But in a technical sense, you are actually voting for an elector who will represent you in Austin, because we're in Texas, and that person will cast a vote on your behalf for the person that you chose, right? If a majority of Texans agree with you. So that's the system of the Electoral College. Now, why is that there that division between them and the electors and you? It's because the founding fathers, the writers of the Constitution, for lots of reasons, were wary of direct democracy. They liked having representatives between the people at large, the citizens, and the laws that were being passed. So they liked having electors between the people and the choice for the president. Only one part of the national government was directly elected by the people in the Constitution as originally written. That's the House of Representatives. Right? The Senate was not directly chosen by the people. The president was not directly chosen by the people. And certainly the judges in the federal courts were not directly chosen by the people. So the first part of the Constitution is the preamble. It says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." First thought, we the people. That means sovereignty comes from the people. The Constitution's authority comes from the people. Now, this preamble is not a law. It's more like a statement of purpose, a vision statement. It is not judicially enforceable. Article 1 describes the legislative branch, and it tells us the basic rules for how the congressmen are elected, how the laws are going to be passed, and how this branch is going to function. So it sets up a bicameral legislature, a House of Representatives and a Senate. Each state is represented in the House based on population, but each state has 2 senators in the Senate. In order to determine how to apportion the House of Representatives, you have a census every 10 years to count the number of people in the United States. A bill to become law requires a majority vote in the House and the Senate, and then the president must sign the bill. If he chooses not to, he can veto the bill, which sends it back to Congress, and then they have to override it with a 2/3 vote, or it's dead. The Senate has an important power to advise and consent on presidential appointments and judicial nominees. I'll talk about that quite a bit later. The executive branch is created in Article 2. It has the authority to ensure that the laws are faithfully executed, to appoint people to assist in administering the laws, to negotiate treaties. The president also is the commander of the military, and the president can veto bills. One power that you might be surprised to know the president does not have is he does not have the power to declare war. He can request that Congress do so, and that's happened many times. But Congress technically has the power to declare war. The judicial branch is created in Article 3. It consists of a U.S. Supreme Court. And Article 3 delegates to Congress the authority to establish other inferior federal courts, which it has done. The Supreme Court has the authority to resolve conflicts arising under the Constitution, the national laws, and international treaties. And since the precedent of a case called Marbury versus Madison in 1803, the Supreme Court has had the power of judicial review, which is the power to determine whether an act of government or a piece of legislation violates the Constitution. Article 4 talks about the relations between the individual states. And it says that the states must respect the rights and liberties of the citizens of all other states, as well as the legal proceedings and decisions of the other states. In other words, a state, the most obvious example of that is marriage and divorce. If you get married in Texas, you're considered married automatically in Kansas. If you get divorced in Kansas, you're considered automatically divorced in Texas. The states respect the laws and the proceedings of the other states. Congress can add new states to the Union, and Congress is prohibited from changing state borders without the consent of the affected states. And each state is required by Article 4 to have a Republican form of government. Article 5 describes how the Constitution can be amended. There are 2 ways. One, by a proposal to amend the Constitution, which passes with a 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress. And then it goes on to be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures, or by 3/4 of special state conventions. So you start in Congress, a proposal passes 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and then 3/4 of the states. There's another way, which is constitutional but has never been done. You can have a proposal by 2/3 vote for a national convention called by Congress on the request of 2/3 of state legislatures. I kind of garbled that. So this starts at the state legislatures. They can ask Congress to propose a national convention, a new constitutional convention, presumably to rewrite the document entirely. That has never happened. Article 6 declares the supremacy of the Constitution. It says, "This Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding." In other words, the Constitution, federal laws, treaties are the supreme law of the land. All state officials and national officials are required to obey the Constitution. And if the Constitution contradicts a state law or a state constitution, the Constitution is supreme. The state law or the state constitution must give way. The last article in the Constitution discusses the ratification process. This is no longer relevant to us because it's already been ratified. So I will discuss this one in the next lecture where I talk about the ratification of the Constitution and the addition of the Bill of Rights.